Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the New Mainstream podcast, where we explore the impact of multicultural consumers on marketing and media. I'm your host, Mario Carrasco, and co-founder of Think Now. Excited to introduce our guest today, Marcela Gomez, Senior Partner at Culture Shift. Welcome, Marcela.
Hi, how are you? So glad to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you on, and thank you for making time. I know you're on your company retreat, right?
We are, yes. We're in South Florida today.
Awesome. Is this something you all do yearly?
We do. We didn't do it in 2020 because of COVID, but my partners and I do this retreat every year. So important to go through everything that has happened during the year with the company, with clients, with our team, and then planning for the next 5 and 10 years, listening to the market, listening to what's happening at a global level. Obviously, we're in a position now that everything that happens globally affects our local markets, and so that's what we're doing in South Florida for the next 3 days.
Incredible. Well, thank you for making time to be on our podcast. I want to get into some of that, but first, tell us a little bit. I know when we first met, you told me about how you got into marketing. I thought it was just a fascinating story in terms of your background. Would love it if you can kind of walk us through how you came to be a partner at Culture Shift.
Sure, Mario. Thank you. So I actually started in Miami, Florida. Let's back up from that a little bit. I actually grew up in Bogota, Colombia, and went to university in Bogota, a la Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano, where I got my degree in advertising, which obviously had marketing, public relations, etc. And in 1993, I moved to Miami. And started working for a Spanish language Christian publishing house in Miami. And so I worked for the advertising department. And my role was to help develop marketing pieces for all of the authors and help develop what the book covers was going to look like, etc. And during my time at this publishing house in Miami, the company launched like the first convention and trade show for Christian publishing in Spanish in the US and actually all Latin America. And I was asked to be part of that team. And so I was in charge of selling the booths to the event and calling the distributors or booksellers all over the United States and all over Latin America and have them come to this big event that was taking place in Miami. So I did that for a couple of years. And then decided to leave Miami and move to another city. At the moment, I had become, I had divorced, so I was now a single mother of a 4-year-old son, and I wanted to raise him in a different place of the United States. And so my son and I moved to Nashville, Tennessee in 1994. And a lot of people still ask me, why Nashville? What was a Colombian doing in Nashville? And what I did was I followed the industry, right? So I started looking for other places in the U.S. that had publishing houses in the Christian world. And of course, Nashville, Tennessee, being the buckle of the Bible Belt, made a lot of sense. So I moved there in 1994 and started working for different companies, ended up as a marketing director for the Spanish language division of Thomas Nelson Publishers, worked there for 6 years. And then I found myself laid off. And that was in the year 2002. When the census had just reported the numbers from the year 2000. And of course, the Latino population in the US had grown tremendously by then, even in the South where I was. And so corporations and government started to look at what they could do to communicate and to reach this market. And so I launched a company called Hispanic Marketing Group in the year 2002, had it for 17 years. I was at one point the only full service advertising and marketing agency serving the Latino market in Tennessee. And so I had a lot of clients who came to me for various reasons, and then met some people along the way that we worked very well together. my one of my business partners, Ann Gillespie, had a company called Prolingua, and she helped corporations internally understand diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to prepare the corporation internally to not only change their demographics at an internal level, but how to reach out to the communities and be prepared for that. And not only just give the check at that event and be a member of a chamber or say, no, we're going to sponsor that event, here's the check, but how do you get the corporation and the employees actually involved in this community outreach? And so then I would come in and help the company do all the PR work and all the marketing, which was consumer facing. In one of those engagements that we did together, we were hired by a big car manufacturing company, which is based in south of Nashville. And their first director of diversity and inclusion, Robert Lawrence Wilson, hired us to help him do a lot of the internal work and also a lot of the work with their dealers in different places of the US. He happened to leave corporate America, and then a year after that called Anne and I and said, I want to work with the two of you. I really love the programs that we put together for the corporation. It made a lot of sense. It made a huge difference, not only as community outreach, but it really affected their bottom line in sales. It increased their sales. And so Robert, Ann, and I launched Culture Shift Team in November of 2017. And here we are 4 years later.
That's incredible. And, you know, I had so many questions come up because you've had such a rich career. I mean, almost from the beginning, right? Focusing on multicultural consumers, Latinos specifically. I'm curious how your perspective is different or similar to agencies that are you find historically on the coast, right? Like Hispanic agencies are either in Miami, New York, Los Angeles. How do you feel that being in Tennessee for those years that you owned Hispanic Marketing Group, how has that shaped how you view Latino consumers versus the other agencies?
Yeah, thank you, Mario, for that question. I had to learn a lot from the beginning what it meant to be Hispanic. And I tell this to people when they invite me to speak. I did not know that I was Hispanic until I moved to Nashville, Tennessee. And what I mean by that is that I grew up in Colombia. I was a Colombian. I moved to Miami. I was still a Colombian. The Miami market is so unique because in Miami, people don't think of themselves as a Hispanic, right? In Miami, when you talk to other Latinos, they're Colombian, they're Venezuelans or Argentinians, etc. They themselves don't put their group into one box. When you move to Nashville, Tennessee, or other cities in the US, all of a sudden you become a Hispanic.
I think it's really amazing, one, that you built an agency outside of the coast, right? Typically, agencies are on the coast, and then multicultural, you're looking at Miami, Los Angeles, Texas. What did you learn building an agency in the South in Nashville?
Sure. It was, I didn't set out to actually build or even, establish a multicultural agency in Nashville, Tennessee. It happened, as I shared before, I worked for a publishing house in Nashville, Tennessee. I was marketing director of the Spanish division of that publishing house. And then I was let go of the job and found myself in Nashville now with a son who was in elementary school and, thinking about, do I want to move back to Miami or do I want to stay here? And I really enjoyed the life in Nashville and also enjoyed, it was really good to raise a son or a child in that area, in that city. And so I started to see that, companies were looking at targeting different demographics. The 2000 census had just started to be revealed. The data had been revealed. It was the beginning of 2002. And I remember driving down one of the main corridors of the city where a lot of immigrants live in Nashville, Tennessee, and still do. And there was a huge billboard, Mario, that it said, in Spanish, it said, Llame al 911, call 911. That's all it said. And I thought, well, if I didn't grow up here, if I'm not from here, uh, why would I call 911? There was no other explanation on the billboard, right? Except llame al 911. Now, I knew what that meant because I had gone to high school in Charlotte, North Carolina. My entire life, I've gone back and forth from the US to Colombia because of my mother's family, who has been in the US since 1959. Anyway, I had some cultural context to that billboard. But the majority of folks, of immigrants living in that area or living in Nashville at the time, were very recent arrivals. Nashville obviously was not a port city, an entry city to the US. So if you landed there, it was because it was construction work or farming work, etc. So I called some of the government agencies in Nashville and said, call 911 doesn't mean anything to us. And it was so funny, Mario, because some people were like, this is what people said to me. They were like, what do you mean? You don't have the police departments in your countries? And I'm like, no, that's not that's not what it means. It just is, there's no context to it, right? So I realized, and that was like in a 2-week period after I got laid off, and then thinking about what do I want to do? Do I want to work for another corporation where I was doing the U.S. Hispanic market, but most of my work at the publishing house was was Latin America, and so our countries, unfortunately, Latin America, the economies go up and down and up and down, and so that international department is the first one to suffer when companies are looking at their P&Ls. So anyway, I thought, here's an opportunity for me to be a consultant in that Hispanic marketing space in the city. And so I decided to launch a consulting firm, or being a consultant, not even a firm, Maria. I was just going to be a consultant. Yeah. And I wrote a press release like every good PR person does. And I sent it to, several of the local general market newspapers in the city. And I still have the clips from those because the National Business Journal, the Tennessean, et cetera, they published that I had opened a firm. And so that it was the National Business Journal who published an article saying Hispanic advertising agency comes to town. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm not a consultant anymore. I'm an agency.
I love it.
So I had business cards. I had one of the graphic designers, a great talent who I had worked with in Miami. He had designed my logo. He did the business cards, and I had to call him and say, hey, change it to Hispanic Marketing Group, and I'm president and CEO because my previous card said Hispanic Marketing Consultant Marcela Gomez. And so all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, so the need was greater. And so then I started, going to your question, I started the process to understand what it meant to be a Hispanic in the United States. And why I say that is because when you live in Miami, and those in New York is similar because I now live in New York, but in Miami, people don't consider themselves Hispanic, right? People, when you're there, you are Guatemalan, Argentinian, Colombian, Venezuelan, etc. And in New York is the same thing. But when you move to deeper, probably, the South, the Midwest, etc., you're no longer that person. You now belong to a box called Hispanic. And so I had to learn what that meant for me. I was only a Colombian, right? I was working mostly for the Latin American market, so I was still a Colombian. But then when I started working with what it meant to be a Latino or a Hispanic in Nashville, then I also was confronted with things like, prospect clients who would tell me, we understand that Hispanics don't read or don't like to read, don't trust institutions like banks or attorneys. And that really impacted me because I thought, who are they talking about? I don't know what they're talking about because I read, and I like to read, and yeah. I've always had a bank and I've had an attorney. My father did the same thing. So I had to start the fascinating process, and it still is to me, of understanding what it meant to be an Argentinian in the South of the United States, what it meant to be a Colombian, a Venezuelan. Sometimes they would ask me, where in Mexico are you from? Those were the questions, like in 2002, 2003 in Middle Tennessee. Where in Mexico are you from? I would say, I'm not Mexican. I'm not from Mexico. So you don't like Mexican people? No, that's not what I said. I'm just not from Mexico. Or, and then my friends still remember people asking me, "How do you celebrate Thanksgiving in Colombia?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, how come you don't? Yeah, how come you don't eat spicy food?" Because I'm not from Mexico. So listen, but all that to say that is fascinating because it is the not the culture that we bring with ourselves, and then how we have to incorporate our culture with it, and become a U.S. Hispanic culture in this area. Um, the sociology of how we have to interact with each other. And then, you're going to find this interesting, but Nashville has two Hispanic chambers of commerce. And which I thought was like, why? Why do we have? Well, we're all very different people as well, right? And we all have different ways to communicate and do things, and we don't have to like everybody because we're all Hispanic, and we don't have one voice. And I think that's important for us to also understand that. I don't speak for everybody in Nashville as a Hispanic, right? And there's not one voice. We are a very diverse population, and so in my line of work, it was I had to understand those differences, the commonalities, but also going, okay, there's also another layer, Mario, which this is the acculturation level. I have been in this country in and out since 1964 when I was born, and my mother would bring me, and I would spend the entire summers in Miami, going to Kmart and buying my Barbie dolls here, going back to Colombia. So I've been very acculturated to this U.S. culture, but not everybody is. And so what does that mean for a marketer or an advertising company to understand the differences between isolated, bicultural, acculturated, assimilated, and retro-acculturated? And that world actually fascinates me.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, and so many stories there to unpack. It's interesting because I find myself sometimes. You mentioned that billboard in the beginning, and that is. I feel like that's not necessarily a multicultural marketing act or thought, right? It's just kind of shifting any culture that would look like at that out of context and putting that hat on. And it sounds like you just naturally have that instinct, like, okay, I get what that means, but what about put yourself in somebody else's shoes, looking at that without the context necessarily of dialing 911 for an emergency, right? I mean, recently immigrated of any country would have a problem understanding that, right? If that billboard was in their native language. So that's really cool how that moment kind of catapulted you into creating your own agency.
Yes,
Um,
that's absolutely correct. I mean, thank you for saying that, because that's exactly what we also do today with our clients. Is part of the consulting that I do is that our firm does is telling clients, you have to understand that if you're reaching a new market, you have to start from zero. You're not, we had a client that has been, is a nonprofit organization, is nationwide. It's been in the market for 105 years, and they could not understand why Hispanics did not know about them. And so it's that consulting and that walking with the client, hand holding, that, we just don't know who you are because da 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 da, not because we don't find or we don't think that you're valuable, the work that you're doing is valuable, because ego comes into play, right? How come you don't know about us, right? You don't know who I am, etc. And so we have to make sure that our internal work, which is why our firm is different than what a typical advertising or marketing firm would do, is that we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion division of Culture Shift team that actually prepares companies internally to be able to do the work to the consumer. So there's a
so
lot of,
tell
go
us a
ahead.
little bit about it sounds like with Hispanic Marketing Group, you were ahead of your time in carving out, saying, look, Latinos, yes, there's something there to call us a group. There's some shared language, some cultural elements. That's one layer, but really we're very different depending on country of origin, depending on how many years we've been in the US, generations, etc., income. How what that's like was your focus in Hispanic marketing group. Tell us a little bit about culture shift. Like what's your philosophy there? How has that evolved, and what elements have you taken from Hispanic marketing group that are at culture shift, and what have you not?
Sure. So Hispanic Marketing Group was in business for 17 years. And during that time, I met another entrepreneur. Her name is Anne Gillespie, and she had a company called Prolingua. And she worked more internally with corporations in helping them understand when they would bring employees from another country and help them prepare not only it started with language, right? People would come from Italy or Germany or whatever to work in Middle Tennessee, or, Japan, anywhere in the world. And she would look like, okay, what are the main elements of the language that you're going to need to know to work for this, company X, Y, and Z. But she realized that culture was the main aspect, the main factor in keeping people apart, or she saw a lot of the employees not being able to stay more than a month or 2 months, or even their spouses in the city. They couldn't understand why they did not fit in, even if some spoke some English. So she and I started collaborating with a lot of clients. We worked together with the car manufacturer here in Middle Tennessee. We worked with a major national airline many years ago that started going outside the US, going to Puerto Rico and Mexico, and they could not comprehend the differences in culture were coming when they would fly in from Puerto Rico, right? So it was very different flying within the United States, where everybody had to adapt to their culture. But then when they were flying outside the United States, they had to adapt to the culture from outside, and that created chaos. So Anne created a whole program for this airline called the Multicultural Lens, and is walking people through 7 different aspects of culture. She and I collaborated in a lot of stuff like that. And so as we both learn from each other about the internal and external work and how it actually relates to each other, and if a company is not prepared internally, then how are you going to reach out to the client? And I'm talking mostly, for example, in the work that Hispanic Marketing Group did that we have brought to Culture Shift team is, we had a lot of companies here in Middle Tennessee and other states that would call me and say, can we translate our brochures into Spanish? And I'm like, okay. But there's an 800 number here. If I call this 800 number, is there someone who is going to answer the phone in Spanish? They didn't know what to answer. They're like, no. And I said, okay. So why would you want this in Spanish? Or then I would ask, okay, we can do it in Spanish. Where are you going to place them? Oh, we're just going to have them in our office when people come in. How are people going to know to come in? What's the distribution of this information? So just going beyond that, right? Or companies who would come to me and say, or in CO2, we want to reach the Hispanics. My first question, Mario, is which ones? And that's the end of the conversation from their end. Right? Because you just said, when we're talking about, we have a lot of clients in entertainment, theater, Broadway, etc. And we want the Hispanics to come. Okay, which ones? Because when you have a family of 6 and tickets are $89 to start with, that's a little expensive. Or if mom and dad don't speak English, then maybe watching a Broadway show, it may not be of their interest. So which one? And I'm not saying that they wouldn't, but what is the open door? Is it their teenagers? Is it their college students? Bicultural, bilingual, who could open that door to say, hey, mom, I want to go watch Phantom of the Opera. I'm going to take you, blah, blah, blah. So there has to be that one person in the family or a group of people in the family that actually opens the door for the rest of them to pass through and acculturate a little bit more. So with Culture Shift team, our basic mantra for the entire company, Mario, is the platinum rule, which says treat others the way they want to be treated. And in order to do that, we tell our clients, you have to know who they are. You have to know how they make decisions, what language they prefer, what culture cues do they have, etc. So it is this beautiful dance and balance between learning about whoever the multicultural market is. Right now in our agency, we serve every single culture. We've just finished a clinical study for one of the main institutions in the United States that does a lot of clinical research, and we did 36 different languages in order to reach them for a COVID-19 trial. And so, but we also bring into our agency consultants that specialize, Muslim American or Native American as well. So we are growing our business into understanding the culture first and then building from there to the top.
That's great. And, one thing I don't know, one thing that I've been thinking of a lot is like, how do we move away from calling ourselves multicultural research or multicultural marketing? Because listening to you, right, that's the new reality. That, I mean, we should just be agencies. Everybody should be taking into account that cultural context, that background, whether it's a religion, like you mentioned, Muslim, whether it's an ethnicity, like somebody from Nigeria, or different age groups. You look at Gen Z; it's going to be the most diverse. It is the most diverse generation ever. It's the first generation that's going to be, a majority from diverse backgrounds. And I think one of the most interesting things that we don't talk about, the fastest growing group is multiracial. So what does that mean when you have, one parent from one culture and the other? You're taking bits and pieces from each culture. And honestly, it reminds me of my experience, right? Like I was born in the United States, all of my family Mexican background, but I speak Spanish, and I take from American culture and from my Mexican background as well.
That's my son. My son, both of my ex-husband and I are Colombian from Bogota. Esteban was born in Miami, and then his father and I divorced, and so Esteban and I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where he was raised, and then he went to university in New York. But Esteban is totally bicultural, and so when he was about 7 or 8 years old, Mario, I remember he was going to school. I was taking him to school, and I saw him with a small Colombian flag, and he folded his flag and he put it in his pocket to go to school, in his shorts pocket. And I'm like, what are you doing with the Colombian flag? He's like, I want to represent. And that just was like, oh my God, that was so beautiful to me.
Yeah.
And so my son dances salsa. He loves empanadas. He goes to Colombia every year to visit his father and family there. And he's a true retro acculturated Latino, right? And I mean, my gosh, we watch Colombia play soccer all the time. So that difference of who he is compared to who I am, it's fascinating because I'm always asking him, like, how do I reach you? Like, if you're my target, how do I reach you? And he's all over the place. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm with you 100%. I think we still need labels. I think we still need labels because we have to be intentional, and companies need to be intentional. But we are no longer reaching out to multicultural markets. We are a multicultural market, period. Right?
Yeah.
That's it. That's what the market is, and so we will definitely walk away from that, because if we are feeling that right now. I think our Gen Z is telling us, hey, stop with the labels, right? Like, I don't want the labels. I don't want to be called a man or a woman. I don't want to be called this or that. And so I think we will evolve into that, but we still are in where companies need to be intentional about it. And so they need to be able to have the labels. I'll give you another quick example. My mother has lived in Miami for over 30 years. She lived in North Carolina, Georgia before that, etc. And so when I moved to Nashville, she would come visit. And when I started the business, she would go with me to events. My mother she's a published author. She was also in publishing. And so she said to me, I have never heard the word diversity more in my life than when I go to Nashville, Tennessee. Because Miami is diverse and they don't have to tell you that they are diverse, right? They don't have to
Right.
tell you. They don't
It's a, yeah, it's Nashville. They're experiencing the change now where Miami has been diverse for a long time.
yeah, since the Cubans arrived in 1960, right? It was like,
Right.
yeah. But so to me, that really, it was like a light bulb when my mom said that. I'm like, oh, you're right. Because we have to be intentional here to be that. And so companies are still calling us and going, we need more diversity. We need more diversity. So I'm not opposed to that, Mario. I think that's important because of the intentionality behind it. But hopefully one day we won't be there and you and I will be able to change the names of our companies or taglines or whatever to just agencies that are reaching out a market. So
No, I agree with you 100%. I think in my mind, it's more aspirational. That's something to move towards, but yeah, I mean, we got to meet companies where they're at. Right. And they're just starting to grapple with this. And it's interesting. It kind of dovetails into something else I've been thinking of. I think there's been definitely a paradigm shift with everything that happened in 2020, with kind of the awakening in terms of everything to do with diversity and inclusion and how we reach out to people of color. And so, there was a kind of a fear in me that, oh, this is gonna, there's a lot of companies putting statements out and, there's a lot of activity in our space being multicultural marketing. But I realized that it's very few companies. I think we still have laggards in the industry, and you're right. Like, we need to say, hey, we're a multicultural agency, because I think 2022, those companies that are slow, they're going to, slowly start coming on board and realizing, wow, all these companies that laid the groundwork for diversity and inclusion efforts, both internally, but also externally from a consumer's perspective, they're going to start to realize those gains. And more companies are going to want to reach this new mainstream consumer in a culturally relevant way, right?
mm-hmm. Yes, and you're right. The companies that all of a sudden everyone was like, you know, doing something, saying something, etc. And we had so many calls last year right after the murder of George Floyd and all the riots that were happening and the marches and everything that was going on. And um, I think in a period of 2 weeks, we were asked to put out 39 proposals to companies because everybody was in a panic of, oh, what are we going to do? And so my business partner, Robert Wilson, who is the third partner at Culture Shift Team, was like, a lot of companies are going to do something that is just for demonstration. It's just going to be something that is going to be a statement, and then that's it. That's where it's going to stop. And that's exactly where we are. Out of the companies that reach out, and I'm sure many other companies like yours probably received hundreds of calls and emails going, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And it was like, okay, here it is. We're going to help you write a statement, or they wrote a statement, or they're Gen Z, or millennials helped them write a statement. And that was it. That was the end of it. So we need to keep pushing. We need to keep doing our work. It needs to go deeper and deeper. And in our company, we were just in our annual retreat, as you know, of our company, and we just look at who are the companies that we want to work with, who are the companies that we want to be able to offer our services and create signature campaigns for. Because I think the last 18 months we've been in reactive mode of companies calling and saying we need help. But definitely Culture Shift Team wants to be more in the proactive of companies that are visionaries, that are looking 15 years down the road and want to leave their legacy with a signature campaign that changes lives, and not just responding to something that happened this past weekend or something that happened 2 months ago.
Agreed. And I think so. I think a lot of this is driven. I mean, there's companies at the top that leadership understands the importance of reaching diverse consumers from a business imperative, right? 10, 15 years down the road. But I think a lot of this as well comes from, people, employees wanting their companies to embrace diversity and inclusion. And I have seen companies that move into this space driven by employees, by ERGs. What's some advice that you would give to maybe companies? I think everybody's thinking about reaching multicultural consumers. Like, what are some steps they can take to start to make the business case internally for, like, hey, we should start to take a look at this more realistically?
You know, when we're asked that, I think my business partners and I are like, if we still have to make your business case, we don't.
I know, I agree with you, but like it happens, right?
Yes, it does. Um, I mean, look at the census data that just came out, right? But listen,
Yeah.
and we are in our company started and is still based in Nashville, Tennessee, where we have companies that um, they're so close minded, and you're like, oh my god. I look at a Blockbuster Video, and sorry to name them, but they're no longer in business. But that's exactly right, right? They're no longer in business. Why? There was no foresight of what was changing. Wasn't it their CEO that at one point said, "Oh no, people will never stop coming on Friday afternoons to get their movies for that weekend"? Well, and so I think it's not seeing the signs, not seeing exactly what's happening. um, there's a lot of movement now. There's a lot, and I know you've seen it. There's a lot of energy going around the Latina buying power. Latina open businesses faster than any other group. There's an author. Her name is Valeria Aloe. She's Argentinian. She lives in New Jersey. She's about to publish an amazing book called Uncolonized Latinas, and it's about the stories of several Latinas in the U.S. that, again, we have come with this uh, colonized mentality of we're not able to do this, but then we get to this country, we're like, no, we're powerful. All of that is happening, Mario, and it's beginning to brew a little bit more. I mean, the work that Claudia Romo does with Hispanic Star in New York and in nationwide, if you're not listening and if you're not feeling that in the energy, you're not going to be in business, because the women are the ones making the decisions for most of the purchases at home. You know this,
Yeah.
right? So, to me, as as a business owner, we ask ourselves all the time, okay, what's going to happen in 10 years? Where are I going to be in 10 years? What's Gen Z going to be like? Like, we're looking just really to the future and not so much about what can we answer today. And I think that's what every company needs to do. And if they're not doing that, if they're still looking at their same consumer, they need to look at, again, just organizations and institutions that are losing their core consumer. I think NASCAR is a great example, um, of
They,
losing
they,
their consumer.
yeah, and I feel like they've been starting to do the work
Hmm.
to reach Latinos, because I mean, I could have, being being Mexican American, I could have told them 30 years ago, Latinos love cars. I mean, like,
Hmm.
it was just a perfect marriage, but it's great that they started thinking about it now.
Yeah. Listen, I represented in PR and Juan Pablo Montoya when he was in NASCAR, and they still didn't know what to do. They still didn't know. They were, but again, it's because part of it is that companies are afraid to do something wrong, and so they don't lean forward, right? And so, fear can totally hold you back and just put you out of business. So, and it's, I think, also is a lack of trusting those of us who know what to do, because they don't know how to relate to us. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I think, again, we at Culture Shift Team want to work with companies that are visionaries and wanting to be part of a growing multicultural market, not just reaching out the multicultural market, but it is a multicultural market, period. That's what the US is. And what is that going to look like for their business in about 10, 15 years?
Agreed. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. I know we have people listening that would love to reach out to you, Marcela, to learn more about Cultural Shift. What's the best way to reach out to you, to connect with you via social?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, Marcela Gomez. Our website is a great place, cultureshifteam.com. And, our bios are there, our emails are there, etc. But I'm on LinkedIn under Marcela Gomez. Would love to connect with anyone. We do a lot of speaking engagements, a lot of internal consulting, and just full, marketing communications, outreach plans for anyone interested in looking at a different market for them.
Great. Thank you so much for being on the New Mainstream podcast, Marcela. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you, Mario. Bye.
Thanks to everyone listening in. To get more multicultural insights, check us out at thinknow.com and follow us on social media. You can also subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform. Final thank you to our producer, Lucas Martinez, who created our intro music and makes our podcast sound great. To email him, reach out to martinez.lucas.a@gmail.com.